The first insight number one, numero uno, okay? We are dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is so important for believers and non-believers. This is important for Muslims and for our brothers and sisters in humanity to understand. This whole world has been turned upside down. This whole world has been turned upside down from a single strand of RNA. All the power in the world, all the armies in the world, all of the money in the world, if you were to put it together and throw it at this pandemic, it could not stop this virus. It could not stop this virus, and it hasn't stopped this virus. Yes, we may find a vaccine in the future, but the point is, if we threw all the power and money and wealth and armory against this virus, we cannot reverse what's happened. We could not reverse what's happened. Look at the 250,000 deaths. I want you to put all the gold coins you can find in the world and place it in the mouth of one of those dead people and tell me if they're going to be resurrected. I want you to throw all the money and power and energy and armory against what's happened and tell me if you can reverse what's happened. It is impossible. It is impossible. This should humble us, brothers and sisters. It should make us humble. And it's very important to be humble, because being arrogant, which is the opposite of humility, is a barrier to divine mercy, to divine grace, and to divine guidance. We must humble ourselves. Also, this should make us realize that ontologically, in essence, individualism, the kind of idea that it's just me, myself, and I, that I have no obligations or attachments to other people or to society, right? As the feminist philosopher Marilyn Friedman said, that individualism is the view that, there's an abstract entity, the individual, that has no kind of attachments or obligations to society or other individuals. And this is a kind of false understanding of what it means to be a human being. We're not individuals in that sense. Forget the political rhetoric and human rights. And this is a different issue. I'm talking about our state of being. Who are we as humans? We as humans, we're not individuals, we're dividuals. We are connected to so many things and people. We are connected to so many things and people. And without them, we couldn't be functioning today. And this whole pandemic should make us realize that we are dependent on the health service. We're dependent on our parents. We're dependent on other members of society like doctors and nurses and key workers. We are dependent. We're dependent on the postman. We're dependent on so many people and things. That this should humble us and make us realize that we're not individuals in that sense. We're all connected to one another. Like, for example, me being in this room, in order for me to get here, I had to rely on a system. I had to rely on public roads. I had to rely on a car that was made by someone outside of me. There's all these variables outside of my control and I have no power over, and I need them. Just like you, brother, sister, friend. There are so many variables in your life that you need, that are essential for your functioning, for your well-being, for your progress and your development. You need those things, and those variables, you can't control them and you have no power over them. So this should make you humble, make you realize that we're not individuals from that point of view. We're individuals. We're connected to all of these things. And fundamentally, all of those things, all of those variables are dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this should make you realize that we must affirm, not only in our hearts and our minds and our tongues, but in our limbs and our actions and the way we live, that we are ultimately dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are ultimately dependent on Allah. Think about when you're a child. Some of us, we have this kind of neoliberal, crazy understanding that we're individuals. It's me, myself, I, yeah? I'm important, primacy on the individual and just his rights, right? But you have to understand something. You weren't catapulted from your mother's womb with the briefcase and a tie. You didn't come out your mother's womb with a tie, with a suit, with a briefcase and a bank balance. That wasn't the case. Just reflect on the first 2 weeks of you being a baby. You couldn't wipe your own posterior. You couldn't feed yourself. If your parents weren't around or your carers weren't around and they just left you in a corner of a room for 2 weeks, you would have died. You were so dependent on them. And they are ultimately dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on Allah, on God. So we need to realize this, that we are dependent ultimately on God, on Allah. Allah depends on nobody. And we need to realize this, and this would facilitate divine mercy and grace. Because if you're not humble, if we are not humble, then we're going to taste the consequences of our arrogance, which could be this pandemic, could be. It could be lack of guidance and lack of mercy. And that's why Allah says in the Quran in chapter 35, verse 15, O humanity, it is you who stand in need of God, of Allah, but God, Allah alone, is self-sufficient, the praiseworthy. And it's very important we realize this. And this verse is teaching us these lessons to make us realize that we are in need of Allah, ultimately, fundamentally. And that if we don't realize this and we have this full sense of self-sufficiency that, yeah, I could do it myself, I'm all right, that actually is a form of transgression. And that is a barrier to divine guidance and mercy. As Allah says in the Quran in verses 6 and 7 in chapter 96 of the Quran, indeed man transgresses because he sees himself as self-sufficient. He sees himself as self-sufficient. And it could be that this pandemic was as a result of a divine mercy to make us realize that we've become too arrogant, we're too self-sufficient, we think we could do it ourselves, right? We have all the power, the technology, the science, we don't need God anymore, right? Says the arrogant fool that forgets where he came from, forgets that he's going to die and become Wembuffet, right? And forgets that his very well-being now was as a result of variables that he has no control over and he has no power over. This is a self-delusion. A self-delusion. And maybe this is why Allah says in the Quran in chapter 6, verse 42, we have sent messengers to nations before you, then we seize them with suffering and adversity that perhaps they may humble themselves to us. So this adversity could be a window of opportunity to become humble and therefore receive guidance and mercy. And by the way, when I say this is why these verses were revealed, that's not the reason why the verses were revealed, but I'm trying to say that, you know, these are the lessons that we can gain from these verses. So this is very important for us to understand. So what I would say is not only must we affirm this, but when we're going to share this narrative to our brothers and sisters in humanity, just talk about, you know, these Quranic examples, right? When Allah talks about in the 22nd chapter in the Quran about the life cycle of the human being, that we're a baby, then we're going to become very old, right? And then we're going to become Wembuffet, we're going to die. These things create a realization within us that, you know what? I need to be humble. You know, Allah tells us that, you know, that we shouldn't be arrogant. Allah tells us that we were a nutfatin min maniyyin, we're a mingled fluid from a despised fluid. This is where you came from, right? Don't think you're someone great and you're totally, absolutely self-sufficient. You came from a despised fluid. If that mingled fluid where you came from was put on the floor and I told you to pick it up and I said, I'll give you 200 pounds, you won't even pick it up. But this is where we came from. We need to humble ourselves. Maybe that we should put that on our Facebook profile, right? Just to make us realize that, look, you know, look where we came from. Allah says, wasn't there a time where the human being wasn't even mentioned? And when we die, after a few years, we won't be mentioned, right? As well. Talk about the fact that we were babies. And in order for us to now be alive today, we had to rely on variables that were outside of our control, that we had to rely on things outside of our control that we couldn't control and we have no power over. And ultimately, all of those variables are dependent on Allah. So this should encourage the non-Muslim or the person that we're talking to really reflect on their lives in a very profound way, so they could see that everything is ultimately dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore we should be humbled, and therefore we should realize that everything actually is as a result of Him.